I want to show you the worst take I've ever seen on a federal anti-corruption body. An unelected and unaccountable agency, such as the proposed National Anti-Corruption Commission, is undemocratic and incompatible with the rule of law. It should be abandoned. But before I get into who wrote that masterpiece, let me give you some quick context. After winning the 2022 federal election, Labor introduced into Parliament their proposed federal anti-corruption model. They called it the National Anti-Corruption Commission, or NACC. Labor also established a parliamentary committee to go through and examine their model. That committee, with a mix of politicians from different parties, invited submissions from experts and the general public. Soon after that, the committee made recommendations, some things were amended, and the NACC was finally put in place. Overall, it's a positive change, but not quite the best that it could have been. I'll be releasing a video soon that will assess Labor's NACC model in detail. So anyway, this committee asked for submissions, and one of those submissions came from the Institute of Public Affairs, or the IPA. I'll let the IPA introduce themselves.
At the forefront of what we do is to further the economic and political freedom of Australians and to maintain and enhance the Australian way of life, and that goes back to 1943 when the IPA was first established. So that's the broad framework within which we undertake our research reports. That of course is also overlaid with what is a relevant issue of the day, what are our members interested in, and what is going to be of interest and could have a positive influence on debate in direction of various policies facing our nation.
The IPA thinks they're the voice for freedom, but in reality, they are massively aligned with the Liberal Party. Tony Abbott is the top affiliate, and a number of Liberal Party politicians also worked there previously. The IPA is also very active with the Parliament, producing reports, submissions, and appearing as witnesses at inquiries. And their so-called research gets a lot of mentions, especially by the Liberal Party.
The Institute of Public Affairs recently published
by the Institute of Public Affairs,
conducted by the Institute of Public Affairs,
of the Institute of Public Affairs.
So I thought it'd be worth having a look at the IPA submission into the Federal Anti-Corruption Inquiry, which was looking into Labor's proposed model. And I have to say, I had low expectations, but even I was surprised because almost everything they said was, in my view, either inaccurate or nonsensical. The submission itself is 3 pages long, and attached to it are reports from previous years which they had submitted in response to the Coalition's anti-corruption model. In those reports, they were even saying that Scott Morrison's watered-down joke of a model shouldn't go ahead because it wasn't necessary. So what do they have to say about Labor's model? The intention of Parliament to reduce corruption is laudable, but granting sweeping powers to an unelected and unaccountable agency such as the NACC is undemocratic and incompatible with the rule of law. The bill should be abandoned. That's a very broad statement. Apparently there's an issue with the Commission being unelected, although I'm not sure of any anti-corruption body or law enforcement agency that would be elected. They're not politicians. It's all very confusing, but let's dive into some of their points. The submission talks about how there will be minimal judicial oversight of the Commission. It says the legislation lacks judicial oversight. Now, judicial oversight means that the court system, and therefore judges, can review the Commission's decisions. This is also called judicial review. But in reality, the NACC is subject to judicial review. The explanatory memorandum, which is a detailed document that accompanies legislation, has a section on this. It says that a person can seek judicial review in relation to findings made by the Commission. Basically, if there is a finding of corrupt conduct involving you can take it to court. So there is judicial oversight. The IPA then says the Attorney General Mark Dreyfus, speaking at the National Press Club, confirmed that the NACC will have minimal oversight. Let's have a look at what the Attorney General actually said.
The Commission will be overseen by a parliamentary joint committee made up of members and senators from across the Parliament, not just government and opposition, as well as by an inspector who will be an independent officer of the Parliament.
He mentions an inspector, and by that he's referring to a new position created by the legislation to directly oversee the Commission. The inspector's functions will include detecting and investigating corruption issues from within the Commission itself, and investigating complaints about its conduct. The IPA then takes issue with how the NACC obtains warrants. It says that the NACC won't need to go to a court of law to obtain certain warrants, like phone taps. Instead, it says that these warrants could be signed off by members of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. The IPA says that this is incompatible with the functions of the AAT. This is simply not true. The Administrative Appeals Tribunal, or the AAT, is like an informal court. Instead of judges, it has what's called members, and some of these members already have the power to sign off on phone taps. In fact, the latest annual report from the AAT shows that this happens all the time. The introduction of the NACC uses the existing system that is already in place when it comes to these warrants. So it sounds like the IPA doesn't actually understand how warrants are currently signed off. Now, whether the current system is good or bad is a separate discussion, but one that doesn't just impact politicians subject to corruption investigations, but you and me more generally. The AAT is also not without its criticisms, and I've done a 3-part series that you can check out of how the coalition has destroyed the AAT over the last decade. Not that the IPA has done any articles or research on that. The IPA then starts to talk about public hearings, which it calls show trials. Here the IPA shows that it really has no idea how hearings would work under the NACC, or is just cherry-picking whatever it can to prove a point. It starts by saying that the power to hold public hearings is a decision for the NACC Commissioner. That's true, but then he goes on to say there are several factors the Commissioner may have regard to when making the decision to hold a public hearing, but these considerations are not mandated. That's apparently the IPA's understanding of how hearings would work with the NACC, and it shouldn't surprise you that it's completely inaccurate. In reality, it is mandatory for the Commissioner to consider 2 separate tests in order to hold public hearings. The Commissioner needs to be satisfied that it would be in the public interest, but then on top of that, they also need to be satisfied that there are exceptional circumstances to justify the holding of those public hearings. This exceptional circumstances threshold goes well beyond the requirements of, say, the New South Wales ICAC, which only has the public interest threshold. In fact, this threshold is controversial and modelled after the Victorian Anti-Corruption Commission, IBAC, and many experts have blasted its inclusion in the federal legislation. The IPA then goes on to make an interesting comparison, saying that the New South Wales ICAC requires 2 commissioners to agree with the holding of a public hearing. This is again true, but I struggle to see how they then use this to say that the consequence is that it will be easier at the NACC than the ICAC to hold public hearings. This is a ridiculous statement, especially given that they haven't once mentioned in their submission the actual thresholds required by each of these commissions, or the fact that the federal model has an additional exceptional circumstances test thrown in over the top. I haven't heard a single expert say that the NACC will hold more public hearings than the New South Wales ICAC. In fact, it's the exact opposite, with many saying that the current law means that at a federal level there will barely be any public hearings. The IPA then tries to explain why it doesn't want any public hearings. Under the bill, elected politicians could nonetheless be pressured into resigning by an unelected agency. To be clear, anti-corruption bodies don't pressure anyone into resigning. What they do is bring to light some new information through their investigations. If the public or the party then expects someone to stand aside during an investigation, that's got nothing to do with the anti-corruption body itself. The IPA is very focused on this concept of an unelected agency. But the police force is also an unelected agency. All law enforcement bodies, both state and federal, would be unelected agencies. Are the IPA suggesting that this means that police investigations also undermine the rule of law? Are they saying that the police shouldn't be able to investigate politicians because that would be an unelected agency putting pressure on them to stand aside if there was an investigation or conviction? It's all just empty buzzwords, but it gets better. The consequence of this is that it would empower unelected judges and bureaucrats to select the Prime Minister. I thought they were complaining before that judges weren't involved. Now, judges are not only involved, but also empowered to somehow overthrow governments and select Prime Ministers. So the IPA thinks that an anti-corruption body is a bad idea. So what's their solution? Is to do nothing, because apparently centuries of constitutional development has established our parliamentary system which allows politicians to maintain oversight over their political opponents. This well-honed system apparently breaks down if you then have an anti-corruption body doing the oversight instead. I mean, this is laughable. How do politicians have the ability to find corruption? How do the voters find out about corruption to then be able to vote dodgy politicians out? Most of the time, corruption lies hidden in the dark. The former New South Wales Member of Parliament, Darryl Maguire, was only revealed to be corrupt by the New South Wales ICAC during their investigation of a totally different bunch of suspects. No one had any idea otherwise, let alone the parliamentary system or the voters. Well, no one except the former Premier, it seems. His electorate voted him in 5 times until he finally resigned when his dealings were revealed. That doesn't sound like a well-honed system of Parliament maintaining oversight. Instead, it sounds like an effective and powerful anti-corruption body doing their job and exposing corruption for voters to see. Thankfully, in this instance, the IPA's opinions didn't get much traction, and now we have a better idea of what value the rest of their publications are likely to hold. Thanks for watching. If you want to help me make more content, please consider checking out my Patreon page, links in the description.